start with Landon and Jennifer for on the game. My presentation is on Cuba. So basically in Latin America, for most countries, the press is less politicized and they kind of focus on the market needs and what they need to do. They focus on the ideological framework of the democracies, but Cuba is completely different than all of that. The media owners and political elites use the media's prominent role in politics to fulfill their own agendas and interests. Because of that, there's an inappropriate degree of collaboration between media and politics. Because of the alliances between media and politics, journalism basically doesn't really exist. It's kind of more like a decorative role that's just said is there. And so the press covers things more tabloid-esque, like political scandal, fashion, gossip, sports. It's less willing to cover in-depth political controversies. In Cuba, the oldest newspaper is called the Diario de la Marina. Cuba was the first Latin American country with a national radio and the third with a national TV station. It was also the fourth to have a professional school of journalism. But then when Castro came to power, there were 6 professional schools of journalism, each graduating around 100 students a year. There were 16 national newspapers and 6 national radio stations. But now, after Castro has been in power for a while, journalism studies are centralized in just a few schools that are very closely watched by the government. The government wants to ensure that all the journalists have loyalty to their editors and basically making sure that all the students who graduate are government ideological soldiers, pretty much, so that they can become the mouthpiece of the government. When Castro came to power, the Communist Party compiled a list of publishers and journalists who were basically to get a monthly salary from the presidential palace. So Castro rules by his creed, which is right here. It says inside, the revolution, everything. Against the revolution, nothing. Against the revolution, nothing, because the revolution has its rights, and the first right of the revolution is to be and exist. Because the revolution includes the interests of the people, the revolution means the interests of the whole nation, and nobody can have rights against it. So basically, the media all has to operate underneath this. So inside the revolution, everything. Against the revolution, nothing. On the 24th of February 1958, Batista, who was the ruler before Castro, his censorship of the airwaves was broken by something called Radio Rebelde, which was transmitted from the Sierra Maestra, which is in the Cuban territory. The rebel leaders used that to basically spread their ideas across the Cuban population and gain support. After the revolutionary leaders came to power, the Radio Rebelde became the most powerful or important and largest radio station in Cuba. But today, free speech is still considered a persistent clash of the elite's interests. So in Cuba, there is censorship of the media. I'll touch on that later. And all media is basically state-controlled. Castro himself has monopolistic control of all the media outlets, and there's no commercial advertising. Everything is state-subsidized. Recently, more things have been let into Cuban media from other cultures, specifically from the UK and the US. But Cuban culture and Cuban media itself is still the biggest thing. A lot of things are still banned, like the Beatles. Can't listen to them. Against the revolution, nothing, because the revolution also has its rights. The communist newspaper that was called the Revolution and the newspaper Nowy Oj were combined to form the newspaper called the Grandma, which is the largest and most prominent newspaper in all of Cuba. It was named after the boat that Castro used when he invaded Cuba during the rebellion. It became the official newspaper of the Communist Party of Cuba, and it represents only the view of the government. So again, it's the government's mouthpiece. It's available abroad in French, Spanish, and English. And its motto is to defend the revolution is to defend culture, which is also, that's why I named the presentation that. So media in Cuba is controlled from the top down. The elites in the media industry decide what information is going to be released to the public, how they're going to release it, and in what type of presentation, through newspaper, radio, TV. And then the elites of the media are formed from the core of the state government. The reports and broadcasts are mostly political propaganda. There's a lot of ideological education and some popular mobilization, but for the most part it's political propaganda for the government. Journalism and all the media outlets are always under the Communist Party's continual watch. The way the censorship works is the Communist Party appoints editors and directors and other higher individuals, and they get these politically reliable appointees up in high positions in the media, all the decision-making roles basically. Then the Communist Party gives these appointees directions on what they're allowed to report on, what they're allowed to say, and how to handle the issues that they're given. And then the Communist Party reviews and criticizes the press and what they put out to the public. A story is never just outright banned, it's always just kept for the right moment to publish it and conveniently never published. Or the writers told it would give weapons to the enemy or bombs of lies to the public. Local newspapers work the same as larger newspapers like the Grandma. They're just smaller, and radio and TV stations work the same way. Although radio tends to have some leeway in what they can say and report because they have smaller audiences and they're shorter broadcasts, and also if you say something on radio, it's not quite as permanent as a printed newspaper. And the first right of the revolution is the right to exist. These are just some examples of political propaganda. That's how the revolution itself survived. Cuban culture has been a big thing, and they tried to use famous artists and famous people. Like you can see there's Castro in this one, and he's famous from the revolution. He was a famous icon. It worked well with spreading the ideas of unity throughout the people. They promote cultural belonging and a positive outlook on the Cuban government. They also wanted to make it look sort of artsy because Cuban culture is big on art and literacy and things like that, so they wanted to fit in with culture. It's possible for writers and journalists to be arrested and imprisoned. It's sort of arbitrary though, because sometimes people get away with saying and publishing things and sometimes they just get arrested. They're always charged with conspiring with foreign powers against the Cuban state. It's pretty much if they just go against the Communist Party. In 1961, Castro said in one of his speeches, "We must be aware that the interests of the revolution come before the newspapers. The interests of the newspapers must be subordinated to the interests of the revolution." And nobody can do against that right of the revolution to be and exist. In 1976, the Socialist Constitution was written, and it did include free press for Cuba, but it added the clause in accordance with our socialist society. Since there were no other forms of legislation written defining the limits of what can and cannot be said, there's sort of a convenient blur between what is and isn't allowed, which allows for more arbitrary arrests. In 2003, there were 79 journalists being arbitrarily held. There's a group called the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention that we're investigating this and asked Cuba to release the people being held were journalists, writers, union leaders, human rights activists, leaders of opposition, people who wanted reform of political and electoral systems.